We got Gators Breakdown here. We know we're business.
Gators Breakdown, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. Coming at you Monday night right here with co-host Will Miles. You can find him at readandreaction.com, Read and Reaction on YouTube, on social media at Will Miles SEC. Well, you might have to carry me this episode. I'm not feeling well. Yeah, I am better than I was over the weekend. Like, I wanted to get some of these topics out over the weekend. I sneezed 50,000 times. My head felt like it was going to explode. I'm on the mend, but the throat is bothering me a little bit.
Well, you picked the right week, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation except for the first week of the transfer portal, which is apparently one of the most dull weeks you'll ever have, at least in the new era of the transfer portal. But we'll talk about it. There's stuff going on. There's always something going on. So we'll let people know what's up in the Gator world right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Plenty to get into with the portal. As Will said, not many commitments or anything to get into, but some updates on some targets, some that have chosen other schools already, some still waiting to choose this week, some coming up. We'll get into all of it right here. Some big news on this Monday as well. And the last few days, as I said, kind of been under the weather. I wanted to do something on Austin Armstrong leaving, but just wasn't in the cards for me in the last few days. So we'll talk about that. And plus, I wanted to wait for Will Miles on that topic anyway. If you've listened to Gators Breakdown for quite some time, you know Will not the biggest fan of one Austin Armstrong and his productivity as a defensive coordinator for the Gators. We'll get into Jake Slaughter. He's getting a brick. I don't know. Many of us saw that coming. I think we like what we saw from Jake Slaughter. I don't know if we knew we would be getting that from him this season. But he is also returning, along with Damian George, who hopped in the portal for a hot second and decided to come back to Florida. So lots to get into right here on this episode of Gators Breakdown. So everybody hit that like button if you haven't liked it. Go ahead and do so right now. Subscribe to Gators Breakdown as well, right here on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. And, of course, help us out even more. You can join Gators Breakdown Plus, get access to that Discord. You get ad-free episodes of Gators Breakdown, all that good stuff right there. Gators Breakdown Plus link is in the description. So Billy Napier did meet with the media in Tampa, but that was just a few hours ago. From what I could tell, he hadn't been asked about Austin Armstrong, so I was kind of going to wait for that as well. But Bill, he didn't talk about it that I know of. We'll see when Florida releases it. But Austin Armstrong is going to Houston, the assistant coach there for the Gators on the defensive side of the ball. Of course, he comes in 1 year after Florida and Patrick Toney separate ways. After Billy Napier's first season. So Austin Armstrong comes in 2023 after a stint at Southern Miss and a quick cup of coffee at Alabama. In 2023, it was a strong start for the Florida defense, fell rapidly, and then the Florida defense mostly failed again in Armstrong's lone year as the sole defensive coordinator. Florida brings in Ron Roberts, and while overall numbers probably don't scream massive improvement, it was a defense that was better, especially after that first bye week. For all intents and purposes, this was Ron Roberts' defense, him calling the plays. After that first bye week, missed tackles, explosive plays were reduced the rest of the season. Then the Gators go on that tear toward the end of the season, getting to the quarterback for a few games, creating turnovers as well. And look, I think looking at this, Will, Armstrong wouldn't be leaving if this was his defense. You don't leave defensive coordinator at Florida for Houston. Somebody who I think was a plus recruiter. I think when you go to that side of it, I do think players really connected well with Austin Armstrong. But as I said, Ron Roberts comes in here. It's his defense for all intents and purposes. And Austin Armstrong now finds himself in the red and white of Houston.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Houston is a downgrade from the SEC in terms of being coordinators. And so this is a decision that Armstrong made, whether he was being sort of requested to move on or whether he decided to make that choice is unclear at this point. But, Florida was not shy about the fact that Ron Roberts was calling the plays this year, especially after the bye week. Roberts was the guy who was going to get a lot of the credit. And honestly, it was a complete change in scheme once they came out of the bye week as well. A lot of cover two shells, a lot more conservative, relying on the front four to get pressure. And then the front four was able to get pressure. But you think about just in general, Florida was a much more conservative defense this year. That game against Ole Miss, or the game against LSU, is the one that really sticks to my head, where they couldn't get off the field on third down because they were being so conservative, but they were also not giving up anything big, which meant that LSU couldn't put the ball in the end zone, and Florida was able to pull it out in the end. So Roberts, look, I mean, Florida's defense wound up, I think, like 52nd, 53rd overall in the country in yards per play allowed. 53rd. So they got 5.3 yards per play. They were like 104th last year, or 110th. They were really terrible last year in terms of the yards per play allowed, in terms of points per game, all that sort of stuff. And Roberts brought a stability that Armstrong just was not able to bring last year. Now, look, I mean, is that all his fault? He's a really young defensive coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you looked at his profile, and this was something I looked at 2 years ago when he came in, is he was a guy who's going to be aggressive, and Florida didn't really have the personnel on the back end to play that kind of defense. So in many ways, he was a little bit hamstrung by the fact that Florida did not have the personnel in the secondary to play the kind of defense that he wanted to play. But I mean, look, my enduring image of Austin Armstrong's defense is going to be Princely Uman-Milan dropping off in coverage, being the best pass rusher, but somehow chasing a tight end or a running back down the field in pass coverage, and the team just getting burned continuously. He gave up a ton of explosive plays at Southern Miss when he was a defensive coordinator. That continued last year at Florida. He did do a very nice job in the second year at Southern Miss of helping his front four get pressure. And again, I think we need to give him a little bit of credit, maybe not all the credit, but some credit for what was going on there at the front four for Florida. So you think about Pyburn, you think about Banks, you think about Jackson, Tyreek Sapp, all those guys have some portion of Austin Armstrong's imprints on there. But I think we all sort of assume and really give a lot of the credit to Ron Roberts for being able to get the team schematically sound to where they weren't just getting gashed continuously. And look, I mean, it's not just an Austin Armstrong problem. Patrick Toney got gashed all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Todd Grantham was getting gashed all the time before him. So it's been a long time since Florida's even had a defense that ranked 53rd in the country. But the defense needs to take another step forward in the next couple of years with DJ Lagway at quarterback, like a top 50 defense. You're going to be skirting the outside of the playoff. If you can get that up to top 30, top 20, and definitely top 10, now you're talking about a team that has a shot to win the national championship. And so this is a move where I think Florida, you can develop a coordinator when you're developing a program, but next year, 2025, it's time for Florida to win. And so having a guy either like Ron Roberts or going out and getting somebody who's even higher profile at defensive coordinator to come in and really sort of put their imprint on the defense right now is going to be critical, because Florida needs to see improvement on that side of the ball. And I think with some of the guys they've got coming back, they're going to be able to build on what they accomplished in 2024. So that's exciting moving forward.
Yeah, you brought up a good point there. I think it will be interesting to see how Florida attacks this. Is Roberts on staff next season too? And are you looking for a brand new defensive coordinator altogether, or just another co-defensive coordinator? Is there a chance there's a change at the top of that side of the ball again, which would give you a fourth new face in 4 years on that side of the ball? It'd be nice for some continuity on that side of the ball for a change. But look, as you kind of said, Will, there's still major improvements to be made on that side of the ball. So you don't have to live in that bend, don't break world so much and afraid of giving up the explosives. There's still so much room to be, a better down-to-down defense.
Yeah, I mean, look, Florida was much improved the second half of the year. If you look, but that Florida State game, that offense was so bad that it's really hard. If you subtract that, it's not. If you subtract those stats from Florida's ledger, the defense wasn't so improved that you say, "Oh, everyone needs to stay and everyone needs to come back." I think, and again, I sort of point at it and say the lack of explosives and the fact that Florida was not shy, that Ron Roberts was calling plays, suggests that this was Ron Roberts' defense, not Austin Armstrong's defense. And so if you're Armstrong, I understand, right? You need to go show someone that you can run the show by yourself to get either another defensive coordinator position in a big boy football like Big Ten or SEC, or potentially a head coach job at some point in the future. You weren't going to get a head coaching position being the co-defensive coordinator at Florida when everyone knew that Roberts was the guy calling the plays. So unless Roberts was going to take a step back and allow Armstrong to call plays next year, I don't think that was really a tenable position for him to be in. And even then, you had somebody who had to come in and essentially sort of show you the ropes to see that sort of improvement. And so going off and sort of making your own way makes a lot of sense for Armstrong. In terms of what Florida's going to do, Armstrong is a bit of a curmudgeon from everything that we hear. And
You mean Roberts?
Roberts, sorry. Yeah. Long day. Roberts is a bit of a curmudgeon from everything that we hear. And so, does he want to stay, right? Was this a 1 year, I'm going to help my buddy Billy Napier straighten things out, sort of show him the way things should be, show the players the way they have to work and the way they have to operate. And when you bring in a new, and either things will straighten out and Armstrong will be able to take back over, or he'll decide to move on and we'll bring in somebody new. That I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, right? I mean, Roberts is at that age where a lot of us want to go retire and hang out with our grandkids, and so it wouldn't surprise me if he rode off into the sunset and Florida decided to bring in a new defensive coordinator in that capacity as well. Continuity, I think, is a little bit overrated. I think what it really comes down to, continuity at coach, I think, is a little bit overrated. I think continuity in terms of the defensive players and them understanding what it takes to win in the SEC. Like, Caleb Banks is not going to sit there and be surprised the first week of the season when they go out there and it's big boy football again. Like, he's going to be ready for that. Same thing with some of the other guys who are coming back as well. And, we'll see. Maybe if Tyreek Sapp comes back, he's obviously a big competitor. And then we got some other guys as well who are going to be back. So Florida's defense is going to have some changes, both likely at coordinator positions, but also at positions specifically on the backside of the defense. And so there's still room for improvement. I think there's an opportunity to do that. I think obviously we're all closely watching the portal to figure out where some of those improvements may come from. And, in all honesty, some of that may come from who they decide is going to be running the defense, right? I mean, if you're a safety or a corner, you kind of want to know what scheme you're going to be working in. And so, can Florida promise that right now to the guys who are in the portal? That's sort of the open question or the hanging chad that I think Florida's going to need to get resolved pretty quickly to make sure that they can be aggressive in the portal on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, we'll see what that means there. Florida bowl game Friday, so maybe a lot of these. And look, probably goes for both sides of the ball. What the coaching staff looks like after Friday. So, all right, keep this episode rolling on. There's a lot to get to here. A big Monday for Florida Gators center Jake Slaughter. He announces his return for the 2025 season, and with that, Florida is returning an AP first-team All-American selection. The Associated Press announced today that Jake Slaughter is a first-team All-American. The accolade officially earns him a brick outside the swamp. Slaughter is just the third center in school history to claim the first-team All-American honor. Slaughter's a redshirt junior out of Spar, Florida, not far from Gainesville. Really, really good 2024 campaign, of course. 728 snaps, the highest total of any Gator this season. In those snaps, Slaughter graded out as the Gators' top offensive player, best pass blocker, and best run blocker per Pro Football Focus. PFF rated Slaughter as the best overall center in the SEC and tabulated that in his 728 snaps, he only allowed 1 sack on the season, 1 quarterback hit, 6 quarterback hurries, 8 pressures, while only committing 3 penalties all season long. His sacks allowed, hits allowed, and penalty totals are improvements from last season, despite playing over 150 more snaps. He also earned 24/7 Sports, CBS Sports All-American Team, second team, PFF All-American first team, College Football Network All-American second team, AP All-SEC first team, and USA Today All-SEC first team as well. Slaughter is Florida's 13th first-team All-American offensive lineman in program history, joining a class, of course, of Osiris Torrance recently, Marquise Pouncey, Lomas Brown, a lot of big names that are right there, Will. Anytime you're a first-team All-American, you're going to be up there with some pretty big names. But for Florida, of course, names that we know mean so much in Gator lore, Jake Slaughter adds his name to that list.
Who says John Hevesy can't recruit? Look, I mean, congratulations to Jake Slaughter. It's a huge accomplishment. Obviously, center is a little bit less competitive than the guard positions and the tackle positions when it comes to I guess the notoriety that you would get. But anytime you're a first team All-American on the offensive line, something's going right at that position. And I think, it's funny. If you'd have told me that he was going to be a first team All-American after the Utah game last year, I would have told you were crazy. We were waiting for Kingsley Egokin to come back to sort of stabilize everything on the offensive line. And then he was out all year, and Slaughter actually performed really well last year as well. Comes back and not only is able to duplicate that performance, but was able to take another step forward. And, you know, a big part of being able to have a true freshman quarterback like DJ Lagway in there for a big portion of the year is having a center in there who can help with adjustments and calls. And, you know, you weren't getting snaps that went flying out of Lagway. You know, I mean, I can't remember a bad snap the entire year either. And in many ways, a center is kind of like the umpire in baseball, right? Like when you notice the umpire, it means he's missing calls. And when you notice a guy like Slaughter, it means that he's that something's going wrong. The combo blocks inside, obviously, when Florida's able to run duo and Florida's able to run different traps and things like that, Slaughter is involved in a lot of that stuff. And then when it comes to pass protection, making sure that he's able to eat up the big guys inside to allow the guard to sort of slide out and help the tackles. When you've got guys who are a little bit more gifted on the outside, they need to block, blitz pickups, all those sorts of things. Florida's offensive line this year, after the first couple of games, we gave them a hard time, and I think deservedly so. But the offensive line really, really improved, and the center is the captain of that group, right? And so not only was Slaughter excelling, I think, as an individual, but he was excelling being the leader of that group. And so congratulations to him. You know, this is one of those things where we harp on stars, but one of the reasons that I want to make that distinction is that when a guy who comes in rated 650th, like Slaughter did, you need to say congratulations, because that's somebody who beat the odds. That's somebody who's one of, 3,000 people who had that rating and was able to work and was able to build himself up into one of the best players in the country. And it's not just all SEC, it's all American. And impressive thing for Jake Slaughter, and congratulations.
Absolutely. So that was just some of the good offensive line news. That was on Monday. But before I think it just happened on Friday. Of course, go back to last week a bit too. Damian George entered the portal and then got out of the portal as the Gators keep him on the team. Add him also to, Caleb Banks' category of keeping players that performed well to build the foundation, the foundation of last season, and keep that going. Did that with Caleb Banks already. Away with Jake Slaughter as well. Don't know the draft love he would have got anything for Jake Slaughter, but first team All-American, you bring him back as well. So Florida bringing back some really important pieces in the trenches from this past season's team now to 2025. Now, look, I'm not saying Georgia's impact is that high as the rest of those guys, but helping keep the turnover at bay along the offensive line that could be returning every starter but Brendan Crenshaw-Dixon. We'll see. Slaughter now returning, we know that. We'll still see about Austin Barber. Don't know about that, but the potential to return 4 of 5 starters along the offensive line now with George coming back as well. Started every single game he was available for this season after starting at right tackle for the Gators last season. Move paid off for him, Will. As an offensive lineman, the whole offensive line took a step forward this year in both run blocking and pass blocking with the help of a mobile DJ Lagway. George improved his pass blocking grade from a 56.7 last year at tackle to 73.4 at guard this fall, according to Pro Football Focus. George did not allow any sacks in 10 starts, missing 2 games due to injury. Overall, I think this is good for Florida, but I hope it doesn't push away the young talent like Bryce Lovett, who started versus Texas and FSU in Georgia's place this past season. He was also named All-Freshman SEC this year, and also a player like Roderick Kearney, who should now be developed enough in 2025, his year 3 to contribute. Ideally, Will, this creates some depth and competition, and may the best man win. Maybe Lovett ends up at right tackle, and you still need George at right guard. There's a few ways this could work out.
Well, so here's what I will say is that Florida for years now has struggled to find replacement level play on the offensive line. There's been a weak link somewhere on the offensive line for probably the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, maybe even. And George this year sliding inside to guard was no longer a weak link. And, the image of Jared Verse bowling him into Max Brown from a couple of years ago at tackle is the thing that obviously we gave him a hard time about, and was something that the fans gave him a hard time about. But that dude put down his head and he worked and he learned a new position, and he learned a position that fits him better. Quite honestly, he was playing tackle out of desperation 2 years ago, not because that was his natural position. I mean, I think everybody sort of assumed when he came in that George was going to slide into the inside. Then you had, what is it, Keontae Walker, I think, for the transfer from Kentucky. Goodwin, Keontae Goodwin, the transfer from Kentucky. I think everybody thought might have an opportunity out at tackle. You had a few other guys that you thought might compete out at tackle, and then it turned out George was the guy who won the job, even though we all kind of assumed he was going to slide into the inside. So you can't have enough solid offensive linemen. Like, you're not going to have 4 guys on your offensive line who are all Americans or who are even all SEC. Like, that's what Alabama does. And Florida doesn't have that kind of recruiting right now to be able to do that. But just replacement level is important, right? And when you've got below replacement level players out on the field and you have a weak link, what that means is everybody else has to pick up the slack. Or what it means is that the stunt gets to the quarterback instead of the quarterback being able to get the throw off. Or the quarterback doesn't trust that when he changes the protection that it's actually going to get picked up. And so he doesn't make the deep throw. He checks it down because he knows he might get hit. And so just having a guy who will execute his job and do that well time after time after time is a critical thing. And so George this year overall, you mentioned his pass blocking, but overall his rating was 70.2 for Pro Football Focus. You look at offensive line play, typically average in the country is like 65, 64, somewhere in that range. And so George was above average at guard. And when you have an above average player at a position like that, where you're trying to protect your 5-star quarterback, worth every dime. I don't know what it costs, but worth every dime to bring him back, man.
Hey, look, that's another thing you mentioned. And I think he played a little bit of guard at Alabama as well, but a full season you'd expect, hey, there's a nice foundation to build on now. Like, I expect him to be even better next year. And you got a good stable of running backs. You got a mobile quarterback. I mean, that helps this offensive line out. But, I mean, I don't even remember it, and I forget what game it was. It might have been LSU. But him pulling and getting to second level and just bulldozing guys. I mean, there were a lot of good plays by Damian George, and certainly glad he could overcome all the vitriol of all the, as you said, the talk of playing tackle. We knew it was not the best fit, and it was not pretty being able to switch positions and now play really well. And to me, should take another step next year.
Well, I sent you a clip maybe like 3-4 weeks ago, and it was a guy in the NFL who Jared Verse was completely running over as a left tackle in the NFL, that Verse is bowled over just like he did Damian George. And I was like, oh, I think we might have been too mean to Damian George.
I remember that now.
Because Verse is doing this in the NFL. Look, I don't know that Damian George is not going to be an NFL tackle. He might be an NFL guard. Right. I mean, if he went right now, I think he'd be an undrafted free agent. He'd get a spot in camp. He has an opportunity now coming back to Florida 2 years or 3 years now in the same system. And really, he can get himself into the NFL draft by taking that next step forward. But again, he doesn't have to take another step forward to be a really valuable player for Florida. And I think that the critical thing that we're going to have to analyze when we look at the transfer portal, when we look at the guys who are staying, and when we look at what we're projecting is, for 2 or 3 years now, we've had to project, right? We've had to say, oh, Jordan Castell has to take a next step. And if he does, that will help. Or, Pup Howard is going to have to take another step. And if he does, then that'll secure the linebackers. And we've gotten some of those steps, and we haven't gotten some of those steps. But here's what I'll say about Damian George. Damian George can play in 2025 exactly like he played in 2024. And that will be a significant contribution to Florida, and that will be a good investment for Florida to have that guy on the team. You can say the same thing about Jake Slaughter. Maybe he gets better, but he doesn't have to get better. If he plays just like he did in 2024, say the same thing about Caleb Banks. If he plays just like he did in 2024, in 2025, or at least the second half of 2024.
Yeah, I was about to say, give me the second half all season long there.
Well, but you see what I'm saying, right?
For
years, we've had to project and say, Florida has a hole here and a hole here and a hole here, and we need someone to step up. And I think what Florida's really doing right now is securing those spots where we don't have to wonder, these 3 transfers they're bringing in, oh, they all have to work out on the offensive line in order for things to work. A couple of years ago with Micah Mazuka, that didn't necessarily work out all that well. Devin Manuel this year didn't necessarily work out on the offensive line for Florida either. And so if you're constantly turning over and constantly churning and constantly hoping you can get a little bit more out of the guy from the transfer portal, than you did from the guy already on your roster, inevitably you're going to miss sometimes. And I think what you see with Damian George, what you see with Jake Slaughter, what you see with some of these other guys who are coming back is Florida just needs the level of production from 2024 the whole way through the season, but just needs that level of production from those guys in order to get to a spot where they're competitive with everyone. Now, obviously, if you want to get to where you're playing with the Georgias and the Texases and the Alabamas of the world and playing in a couple of weeks in the big games as opposed to playing in the Gasparilla Bowl, then yeah, some of those guys might need to take a step forward. But we're not talking about having to take a step forward to get to 7-5. We're talking about having to take a step forward to get to 10-2. And that's really, honestly, the only way that Napier and this program is going to be measured in 2025.
Well, off the top of my head, I can't remember. We guess, like I said, we still have to see what Austin Barber does, but Florida could return 4 offensive linemen, and they'd actually be in the same spot. Like we said, George had to switch positions. Austin Barber switched from right tackle to left tackle. But right now, from right to left, you can have George, Slaughter, Harris, and Barber all coming back.
Well, and you mentioned Lovett, who potentially, who's gotten a lot of playing time and would be there as well. You got Cam Waits, I think still has 1 year of eligibility, right? So not only do you have guys who are coming back who've started, but you also have guys who have significant experience who can jump in if in fact you have any issues along the way. That's without adding anybody in the transfer portal, and it's without recognizing that guys like Fletcher Westphal, who were guys who came into the program last year, are going to have an opportunity to potentially step up as well.
Now you don't have to force those guys in before they're ready. Like, offensive line is a developmental position. We all know that. It's being said over and over again. Now you don't have to force guys out there before they're ready.
Still would be nice to have Solomon Thomas out there right back. I'll tell you that. So, I mean, look, this is about as optimistic as you're going to hear me because I can look at these numbers and say, okay, like there have been times where I've looked at Florida's offensive line and I've been like, this is a catastrophe.
Hey, everybody remember before the season with me, I threw him under the bus, and hey, it took time to get to a point to where, hey, that's a solid group right now. I won't be saying that next year.
Well, and they still have to earn it, right? I mean, look, Damian George played well this year. He still has to do that same level. Jake Slaughter played very well this year, but you don't get the first team All-American the next year. You got to go out and earn it. And obviously you got to stay healthy too, because that's a big component too. Austin Barber, you look at his pro football focus ranking this year. It's not great, but part of that is he's been nicked up the entire year too. And so just being able to make sure that you keep those guys healthy. And part of that is when you're playing the little sisters of the poor to open up the season next year, to be able to rotate in 7, 8, 9 guys, to get them all that experience, to get to a point where, hey, let's actually blow somebody out next year so we can let guys sit out for a half a game. And this year was really unique for Florida in terms of they just were playing all sorts of teams coming off of buys and, having all sorts of rest and those sorts of things. And these guys were able to hold up over the entire season. So, you look at it was funny early on in the year, you looked at the injury chart, you're like, what is going on? Like, I thought we changed our health and our strength and conditioning, but over the course of the year, the team actually really did hold up pretty well, especially when you think about up front, on the defensive line and the offensive line. Those guys, we were not constantly talking about injuries there. Now, the defensive backfield's a different story. Maybe we need to change some things we're doing with the corners and the safeties, but at least offensive and defensive line, Florida stayed pretty healthy.
Yeah, like I said, we just talked about George there. Only missed 2 games all year. And like I said, I think that went a long way in this offensive line improving. Going to your point, Will, is you had guys that had played a lot of snaps together as the season went on. All right, before we get into some other portal targets that have been on campus for Florida, let's think about a couple departures right quick, only because both of them going to LSU. Jack Pyburn and Jakeem Jackson going to LSU. Will Pyburn, I said my piece last week on Gators Breakdown, so I think most people know what I said there. It still hurts. Both of these guys going to a school that you will play next year. Hey, look, that's college football now. And look, kind of go into it and talking to some people around Jacksonville as well. It's still, this one kind of stings a bit. And I think it was on the Gators Breakdown Plus Discord this morning. It said, somebody even said, hey, look, this one hurts more than ETN last year because we know Pyburn was a Gator. He grew up a Gator. He go back to his signing day when he's signing for Florida. It's a dream to play in the orange and blue. And now he's in the purple and gold of LSU, one of your rivals. And that's where he's going. That's this new world of college football now. Look, I said he was a plus player. I'd rather him be on the Gators roster than not on the Gators roster. He's not irreplaceable. Florida can have some options there. In the end, I'd still rather see Pyburn in the orange and blue on that Gator sideline, but that is not to be. I know Jakeem Jackson battled injuries this year. Was supposed to be cornerback 3 coming into the year behind Jason Marshall, behind Devin Moore, got injured, never really kind of broke through, of course, because of that injury. Both guys in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, I mean, so look, if you look at the corner position, Dijon Johnson and Aaron Gates really stepped up this year, and so you figure those guys were going to be tough to overtake. And then if you look at Pyburn, I think there's a couple of things there. Obviously, there's been all sorts of stuff reported, but LJ McCray is coming. And like you think about who's going to be getting time at a defensive end, that guy's going to be the guy who gets priority and who gets preference. And Pyburn wasn't necessarily always going to get the same number of snaps that he got this year. He was a replacement level player, 70.2 for PFF. So not like above and beyond anybody out there. It wasn't like he was like Tyreek Sack was 89.6. Like that's a guy who like was a difference maker up front. Pyburn made a difference. But I think his difference is overestimated because in many ways that's when Sapp and Banks and Jackson really started to assert themselves. And those 3 guys are the guys that I look at and go, that's why Florida's defensive line started to take over. Now, was some toughness from Pyburn necessary? Did he have some leadership that probably helped those guys along? Absolutely. And so you thank him for his time, but this is the way college football is, right? I mean, Florida had to make some decisions. And if you told me I get Slaughter, Banks, and George, but I have to give up Pyburn, okay. I mean, I think depending upon who's coming in the other side, and I think that's the question, right? Is it's always a question of opportunity cost. So if they bring in some project who hasn't really performed yet from New Mexico State, okay, I would have rather had Jack Pyburn. If they bring in some guy who had a PFF rating of 77 last year from a big-time Power 4 program, and that guy's going to slot in, and he's going to compete with the LJ McCrays of the world and that sort of stuff, I go, all right, upgrade. Like that was worth doing that sort of stuff. But it's sort of –
and you got George Gums at the position, too, who came along as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Florida – I am never going to say Florida should give up a productive player on the defensive side of the ball ever again in my entire career covering this team, based on what I've seen on the defensive side of the ball for the past decade. At the same time, roster building is about choosing how to allocate your resources appropriately. And Pyburn is one of those guys who I don't think is going to play in the NFL, at least not. He's not going to make millions of dollars in the NFL coming out of college. I think, he hasn't shown the explosiveness and hasn't necessarily shown the skills you would be looking for. I'd be surprised if he runs a ridiculous 40-yard time and the shuttles and all those sorts of things coming off an ACL injury. So he sort of understands the shelf life of football players, maybe more than some other people do. And so if he had an opportunity to make more money right now as a senior in college, I mean, given the current circumstances of college football, more power to him, and he needs to do that. But Florida also on their side has to be responsible with the funds that they have as well. They got to make sure that they are taking care of the guys on their roster that are like, we can't lose these guys. And then they got to make sure that they got the funds to go get the guys that they need to add who are going to be difference makers. And I think, all year long, I've been talking about where are the difference makers going to come for Florida and where are they on the defense? And for most of the year, basically until the Texas game, I would have told you there aren't any. But then when you start looking at the overall stats, and you start looking at those last 3 games, Tyreek Sapp and Caleb Banks, and in some ways, George Gums kind of started to be those difference makers, and they need to continue to do that. And if I look at the profile of Jack Pyburn, he's a guy who could be a solid player, but I don't think he's going to be a difference maker at LSU, and I don't think he's going to be a difference maker at Florida. And so he's a replacement level player. That is a valuable player, and you do not want to lose those guys in a vacuum if you can't. So then it's always a question of compared to what, right? So if they bring in a guy if they bring in a mercenary from UNLV, well, you strip him from Mullen, that's fine. But you bring in some guy from Long Beach State, okay, like there's some risk with that, right? I mean, we brought in Joey Slackman last year, and that didn't necessarily hit, even though he was somebody who had great ratings throughout the year. So
and to bring him up too, George Gums, we didn't know what to get out of him. Like they loved his size, they loved his potential, they loved what he looked like, and then as the season went on, you saw it. So yeah, it's hard to tell.
Well, I mean, I think what it boils down to is like, so people always get all uppity when a 5-star. I always hear it in my mentions when a 5-star flames out. It's like, yeah, they end up getting drafted in the NFL 70% of the time, which means 3 of the 10 guys at that level are not going to pan out. So you can't point at one individual 5-star and tell me you've proven me wrong. That's not true. And I think the same thing applies to the portal. Now, the portal, like if you think about junior college guys years ago, those junior college guys used to come in and they probably had a hit rate of like 30 or 40%, which is higher than the hit rate that you get from just a normal high school recruit who's in that 3 or 4-star range, but it's lower than the hit rate of a 5-star recruit. And so we saw that this year at safety, where Florida had DJ Douglas, Asa Turner, and Triquez Bridges all come in through the transfer portal, and only one of them hit.
Yeah.
And so, I think in many ways, the transfer portal, there are multiple ways to use it. Like you can go get the best guy who's out there that you think rates the best, but everybody's bidding on that guy. The other way to potentially do it is to go out and stack and say, okay, we know we have a need at free safety. We're going to bring in 3 guys who are all solid, and one of those guys might turn into a star. Maybe you get a guy who's got high upside. You get a guy who's like got a really high floor, and then you get a guy who's sort of, in between. And like, if I was going to say, I would say Douglas was the guy who was maybe had the high upside this year. And then Asa Turner was the guy with the high floor, and Triquez Bridges was the guy who's sort of like in between. And it turned out Bridges was the best player at all 3, at least this year. But if Florida hadn't brought in Bridges, if they just said, we brought in Asa Turner, he's going to be our safety, we don't need any more help at that position, boy, what would the defense have looked like without Triquez Bridges out there, right? And so, they wound up with Bryce Thornton playing a ton the last few games, but Thornton, I'm sure, had been pushed by the fact that he had fallen down the depth chart with all these other guys coming in. So to me, there's a couple of different ways you can play the transfer portal, given the rules and given the way finances work. And I know everybody wants to see former 5-star guys come walking in the door, but there's a reason those former 5-star guys are looking for a different place to play. Sometimes it's because there's somebody better in front of them. But if there's somebody better in front of them, were they really is that really a 5-star who's working out? Because they, ostensibly a 5-star means you're one of the top 30 guys in the country. So you shouldn't be behind too many guys on your own roster. And then part of it is, hey, a 3-star guy might be one of those high floor guys who's behind the high ceiling, or vice versa. And so I think there's some opportunity there to stack. And that's what I'll be curious about. Florida has some definitive holes. They got some holes at wide receiver. They got some holes at safety, certainly. They probably need to bring in some reinforcements at corner as well. My guess is they'll bring in some corner, star, safety tweeners, and then they're going to stack at those positions. And so, I know people are getting a little bit antsy about who's coming in the portal over the last week or so. But given what Florida's done in the past, I think they're probably going to end up stacking guys who are not necessarily the highest profile guys, but the goal will be to get one of those guys to pan out, similar to the way you think about a few years ago in high school recruiting. They bring in Trey Wilson, Aiden Mizell, and Eddie Jean. Jean's already transferred out. Mizell has sort of contributed a little bit. And Trey Wilson was one of the best players in the team 2 years ago. And so, oftentimes stacking at those positions makes a major difference when you don't have a ton of 5-stars. And certainly that's a space where Florida is right now.
That would have been his 2022 class. Yeah. Or the 23 class with those receivers. Go look at the defensive line in that 23 class too. That's because of Kelby Collins on the way out, and it's I got it pulled up here, Will. But since you brought it up, you're talking about clusters, and that was a really good defensive line haul class for Florida. But I'm not sure how many of those guys are left. Kelby Collins, let's see, Cam James was on that list. TJ Searcy's on that list. Gavin Hill, of course, who had to switch positions and play tight end. He's on the way out. Will Norman was on that list. He's already out as well. So you talk about clusters, and it was a pretty good defensive line haul. Let's see how it all shakes out. Some guys playing edge now, like TJ Searcy. So, yeah, interesting when you brought up recruiting there. I remember that position group in that year came up on the Gators Breakdown Plus Discord with our good friend Bill Sykes. So
yeah, well, Bill wrote an article for Read and Reaction a few years ago where he was talking about clustering and how that's really what you need to do when you don't have elite recruiting. And his point was Alabama always has a cluster of guys coming because they've built that over the years. And that if you want to win with an elite quarterback, you have to cluster talent around him. And so the portal allows you to do that in a way that you haven't been able to do before. And so again, I don't know the answer to this question because I don't have enough data to be able to go back and look at it. I know that I think you have to build the offensive line through high school recruiting. I think that's a developmental position, and that if you're constantly trying to plug holes there, you're probably going to struggle. I think the same thing probably applies for defensive line. I think this year kind of reflects it, that you can build linebacker and defensive back through stacking. And so Florida stacked at linebacker last year, both with Aaron Childs and Miles Graham through recruiting, but then also Pup Howard and Jaden Robinson through recruiting, but also through Pup Howard through the portal. And you combine that with Shamar James, who was their highest rated recruit a few years ago. And look, James has not been like a world beater out there, but he doesn't had to be because he's had all this support from these other guys. In fact, Pro Football Focus had Miles Graham as the best linebacker on the team this past year. And so, Florida has an opportunity to sort of they have enough linebackers that a guy like Derek Wingo, who really struggled this year, PFF rating of 37.5, didn't get a lot of playing time. A guy like RJ Moten played okay, and he wasn't out there a ton. And so, I think linebacker and defensive back you can stack. I think offensive line and defensive line you probably can't. And so when you think about where Florida's spending its money, bringing a guy like Banks back, bringing guys like Slaughter and George back, honestly, that I think is where it makes some sense. Because of where they are, right? They're at a place where they have to win in 2025 or 2026. And really it's 2025 is what they're aiming towards. They got the quarterback. Napier hit on the quarterback, and now it's time to cluster around him. Now, what'll happen when Lagway leaves? That I'm a little bit worried about, because we saw what happened at Florida State this year after Jordan Travis left and all the transfers left and that there wasn't any depth left. I think Florida will have more depth than Florida State because the recruiting classes at Florida have been better than those at FSU. But, just the things to keep in mind, right? That I think Florida has an opportunity to sort of build to a crescendo here in 2025, but there is downside risk on the back end to building that way. You just have to be cognizant of it.
All right, let's get to some more transfer portal talk. One of my top targets, of course, I put out last week was not hiding behind this one. Zachariah Poyser, safety. He will be deciding on Wednesday, He was in Gainesville for an official visit from Friday to Sunday. And a revelation on his visit, though, as DB coach Will Harris sees him more as a fit at the star role and not safety. So Poyser played both safety and star across his 108 total snaps, where he graded out with an 80.8 overall grade on Pro Football Focus. And remember, Aaron Gates went down late season with an ACL injury, so there is a need for depth at the nickel star spot. Does this affect his decision in any way? I think that's the question we have to ask here. Miami is another school Florida is in competition with, along with LSU and Auburn. With this revelation that Florida wants Poyser at star, I guess we'll still also need to see if Florida pursues a true safety in the transfer portal. It makes sense for Florida to want to add another body at star with the injury to Gates, but we'll just have to see if that appeals to Poyser and if he wants that spot. Wide receivers. We talked a lot last week. Chase Sowell, he committed to Iowa State. Reggie Virgil committed to Texas Tech. Those are two of the wide receivers we mentioned last week as the Gators having interest in. Sowell was supposed to visit this coming up weekend after the bowl game. And look, I'm not really sold on Florida wanting, guys, if they're committing to those type of schools. Just in general, I'm not sure the story here. Is Florida not being aggressive enough? Don't get me wrong. Those are good players I would have liked to have on the roster. But you're not going to sit here and tell me they're major missed targets. Now, where this can hurt you, Will, and where I look at it, is if you are targeting other wide receivers and then miss out on those guys, and these guys were maybe your backup options or something along those lines, then it can turn into a bad situation. But I don't think we're there yet. I did like them as big downfield targets. Doesn't seem like anything will also happen with Oklahoma transfer wide receiver Nick Anderson, as LSU seems to team to be right there. And no more visits for him. Texas A&M and LSU, kind of the schools there for him, but it seems like LSU's the leader in the clubhouse. And then this past weekend, as we're going to stay at wide receiver, UCLA transfer J. Michael Sturdivant did visit campus this past weekend, left campus without committing. I know there was some thought he could shut it down after the visit. Georgia and Miami are getting into the mix with him. I think Georgia's trying to line up a visit later this week. Like where Florida sits now, but more visits can certainly change this, and that Georgia visit later on this week. So other names of note, of course, still waiting for what happens with defensive tackle Keeshawn Silver. Visited Florida, USC, Michigan last week, Miami over the weekend. A hefty NIL price tag in play here. Seems like the longer this one goes on, less favorable it ends up for Florida. And then new targets coming out today. Edge Amaris Williams, a one-time Gators commit. He enters the portal from Auburn, 1 season there. Florida will be pursuing, but seems like maybe North Carolina might be the team to watch. And then Texas wide receiver Jonte Cook, the former 5-star, is reportedly visiting Florida later this week. After the bowl game, he told Gators Online, 6 foot, 185 pound, also has Washington in the mix.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Poiser is the guy to watch. That's the space where Florida needs the most help. Obviously, you mentioned Gates' injury. Them wanting to put him at star, assuming he's aligned with that. Florida, the reporting out of, I guess Neil Blackman was the one reporting that they were going to use the buyout money when it came to driving both the recruiting class and the portal. And so we'll see, because he's the guy that I look at and say, yeah, you need him. Like, you need him, and you need more like him at that particular position. The wide receivers, I'm less worried about. I mean, if you think about Shamir Dike, and when did Elijah Badger decide to come? I mean, it was April, right?
Yeah,
May?
April, May, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was after we released our preseason magazine. So we're sitting there going, oh, that completely changes what's going on. And the other part is there was a lot of speculation that Trey Wilson might not be back either. And so having him there along with whoever you're going to bring in, I think, again, having those guys who are already replacement level or better on the roster to start with becomes a good starting place. So guys like Mizell, guys like Wilson, that sort of stuff sort of set your floor. And now the question is, where can you get from a ceiling? I mean, look, Florida, if you took Elijah Badger off the team last year, we're sitting there talking about the wide receivers being a struggle. I mean, I think Shamir Dike played very well, but I'm not sure necessarily that he plays as well if they don't have Badger on the outside taking the top off. And so the biggest addition came in May. And so I know people are getting antsy, and I know people are looking at these wide receivers and saying, why don't they want to come here and all that sort of stuff. And in some capacity, that might be true. The other part is that Billy Napier has a reputation for being slow, methodical, forthright with these recruits. At the same time, Elijah Badger, Shamir Dike played a ton, right? So the guys that he's targeting and going to say, yeah, you guys are going to step in, like once those guys are available, I think that they'll know. So some of these 5-star guys you mentioned, Sturdivant in particular, those are guys that I think Florida's targeting, and I would be surprised if they get outbid for all of these guys. It's just, I mean, look, they only need 2. Right. I mean, maybe 1 at wide receiver, depending upon what they think about who's in their room and what they think about guys like Hawkins and Abrams and some of those guys who didn't get a ton of time this year, but are going to have to step up into those roles. And so I'm not worried about the wide receiver position, just like I'm not worried about the running back position, just like I'm not. The place I'm worried about is safety. I'm worried about safety and corner. Like, that is the spot where if you told me Florida needs to overspend to bring guys in, that's the spot. I'd be like, and defensive line, I mean, look, I'm not going to complain if they overspend to bring in more defensive linemen. Certainly you want to be able to replace Pyburn, but you need McCray to step up too. And so in many ways, I think the overspending needs to be in the defensive backfield. Florida played conservative this year, in part because that's what Ron Roberts wanted to do, but in parts because that's what they had to do. Like, they did not have the guys on the back end, at least given their experience, to be able to be incredibly aggressive on the back end of the defense. They couldn't just go man-to-man and go out there and dare teams to beat them deep, because they did. And so that's one of the reasons why they played the types of coverages that they did. I don't think they'll go all the way back to playing man-to-man aggressive like they did under Austin Armstrong or Patrick Toney. I think they've learned some stuff over the past couple of years in the transition from Armstrong to Roberts, just like Roberts did when he went to Baylor. That was one of my big questions in the preseason magazine, was Baylor played a very different defense than Roberts had when he was at Louisiana. And then at Auburn last year, Roberts was much more like the Baylor defensive coordinator than before. And I was like, is he going to bring that to Gainesville? And he did. And so I think Florida learned some stuff there. I think they'll still be a little bit more conservative on the back end, but that's the place where they need improvement. So Poyser's the guy I'm looking at and saying, don't get outbid there, because he's the guy you've targeted. He's the guy you've had on campus. He's the guy you're saying we can envision him in our defense. So make sure you get him. And I think the receivers will sort of fall into place over time. There's a real attractive selling point there, which is that DJ Lagway is going to make you a boatload of money if you can run fast and past the corner. So, and he's going to take the shots. So I don't expect Florida to have a ton of trouble there at that position.
The one commit Florida did get, Will, I hadn't had an episode since then, of course. Tommy Doman, punter from Michigan, grad transfer as a freshman before playing 4 games as a sophomore in 2022 with the Wolverines, handled place kicking duties and punted. As a junior, Doman punted, kickoff, held in all 15 games as the Wolverines secured their 2023 national championship. He averaged 44.3 yards per punt with a 71-yard long on 53 punts, and was named all Big Ten third-team selection by the coaches by season's end. In 2024, this past season, the 6'4", 215-pounder saw his statistics dip slightly, averaging 42.6 yards per punt. So I think, Will, going through it right now, kind of does feel like repeat. And I remember doing it last year too. Panic or patience in the portal right now. I think it's way too early for panic, but I get the concern. It's never in my role to tell fans how to fan. Fan how you want to fan. If you want to be concerned, go be concerned. If you want to praise and have some patience right now, by all means do so. I think, kind of going to your point, Will, looking at the timeline, still expect many more transfers to enter after bowl games and playoffs. I have no idea if targets are on those rosters, but I'm willing to wait and see the approach. Not going to sit here and act like some of these targets we have discussed won't be misses and Florida may have to pivot, but have to believe there are many more other that aren't in the portal yet in this window, and also the spring portal window that has done some good for Florida in the past. But look, that's not a guarantee. So might be playing with some fire here. We can fully admit that. It's a little deja vu with the slow start. Not many big names on campus yet. I admit that, but the portal has produced some good for Florida, even with the slow starts. Look, everybody knows if you listen to Gators Breakdown, I've wanted to be more aggressive overall in the portal since Napier's been here. Just not how, as Will kind of mentioned, just not how he plays this. I'm not panicking. There are some big decisions this week. And another angle to this, I don't know how many exactly, how many roster spots exactly Florida is playing with right now. I'm not sure how many more Florida will lose off the roster. Plus guys like Cormani McLean, Jason Zanamella, Caleb Rios getting scholarships for the 2025 season. So in the end here, Will, for me, it's all about Florida taking advantage of this momentum that they built to end this season, build around Lagway. I do like a lot of the roster Florida has, but this isn't, kind of going to one of your points earlier, it's not about getting similar results as last year as far as record goes. This is about taking the next step and enhancing the roster. I believe the transfer portal, you can enhance the roster. This is about giving yourself the best chance to win week in, week out. No doubt the roster has to be upgraded through the portal to get, so I get some of the frustrations. It's only been a week since the portal's open. So patience may be needed more than panic for the time being.
So here's what I'll say is that when I try to evaluate recruiting classes, I try to evaluate them holistically and say, all right, let's look at the 22, 23, 24, 25 players and evaluate it. It's one of the reasons why people got angry with me when I evaluated the recruiting class a couple of weeks ago. It's because, yes, Billy Napier did a great job of flipping 10, 11 guys there in the last few weeks, but the recruiting class is still not competing with Georgia's and Alabama's and Texas's of the world. And I think we all know that. It's just, everybody gets mad when you say it because it felt good to see all those guys flipping to Florida. I think it's the same thing when it comes to the transfer portal is we have to evaluate it at the end. Now, recruiting, we've got years and years and years of history of understanding that, hey, where you stand in August or September is kind of where you're going to stand in December or February. It's just a question of, the total volume that you bring in. You're going to sign some more players, but it's going to kind of be the same talent level. I think at the portal level, we don't really know yet. We don't have years of data to go back and say, oh, well, if you're not aggressive in the first week, it turns into a disaster. And honestly, even last year was very different. If you remember, the portal opened up before early signing day. And Ole Miss went and just absolutely raided the portal before early signing day. And one of the things that I was wondering there was, did they do something wise? Because they basically bid on everybody in the portal before the prices went up after people missed on early signing day. This time it was flipped. Early signing day hit first, and then the portal came. So there's a little bit of a timing issue here too, where we don't necessarily have data to go back and look at it. So what that means is we got to look at it holistically once everything closes and say, all right, once the transfer portal closes, and really, honestly, once the spring transfer portal closes, where do we sit? And I think it's difficult to be patient to be able to do that, but I think that's the only fair way to do it. But the other thing that I'll say is that Billy Napier has a program that recruits in the 10th to 14th level in the country, 5th to 8th in the SEC. What reason then would we believe that he would be any better in the transfer portal? Like, why would he be better than Georgia or Tennessee or Oregon or Texas or Alabama in the transfer portal than he is when he's recruiting high school recruits? Like, I think that stuff just sort of carries over. So what you're really relying on here, and this is what you and I've been saying now for years, is you're going to have to win you're going to have to win a bunch of games because of DJ Lagway and surrounding him with the right guys. You're not going to be able to rely on out-talenting people out there on the field. So you need guys who are replacement level. You need guys who go out and contribute and are able to hold their own. And then Lagway's going to have to do some special stuff. And you think about like Miami, where they were this year. Like, there were some games where Cam Ward was able to pull them out. There were some games where Cam Ward wasn't able to pull them out. And all of a sudden Miami's on the outside looking in because they didn't have the level of talent of some of these elite teams. And that's not to say that they shouldn't beat Georgia Tech. It's to say that you lose two teams like Georgia Tech and like Syracuse when the talent level is closer than it is between Georgia and Syracuse, or Georgia and Georgia Tech, and Georgia Tech almost got them too. So anyway, all that being said, this whole thing rides on Lagway. I mean, if something happens to Lagway, if he can't keep his hamstring healthy, if he ends up injured or something like that, it doesn't matter who Florida brings in through the transfer portal, and doesn't really matter what Florida. I mean, Florida's just trying to float and tread water until he comes back. He's the path to the playoff. It was unfair to cast that on him as a true freshman, and he exceeded expectations in many ways this year. But that's what he came here for. He came here to Florida because he understood what it means when you're the quarterback here at this program. He had that whole quote about you're either gonna win with us or you're gonna watch us win. And you come in here with that sort of attitude, and he's starting to deliver on that. And that's just what's going to happen. I don't think DJ Lagway being here is going to like make people flock to Florida. I think Florida's going to have a talent level that's sitting in the 10th to 15th in the overall country, 5th to 7th in the SEC. And then the question is going to be, when you have DJ Lagway chucking it around and you have a top 10 offense because of that, does that get you to where you need to go? And so, all that being said, holistically, we want to take a look at the transfer portal at the end when it closes. I'm not going to panic about a week. I mean, and honestly, I'm just not going to stress out over something that, one, I don't have the data to understand what's good and what's not. And two, just is not in Billy Napier's nature. That guy does not go out the first day everything hits and make decisions on who he wants to bring into his program. And if you talked about Napier and his ability to keep the locker room when things were going south, I think you have to then say, okay, that means something. Whether it means everything is a completely different question, but that means something. And the only way that you get there is not by, like, if you had a bunch of mercenaries, things would have fallen the other direction. And we saw that in Tallahassee, right? Tallahassee, they had a bunch of mercenaries and everything went the other direction when things started to go south. And so it's a different way of building. It's not the way they build at Georgia. It's not the way they build at Alabama. And it's going to be frustrating at times, but at the end of the day, we might have the best quarterback in the SEC and might have the best quarterback in the country next year. And when you can say we might have that guy, you can get it done with what Florida's going to be bringing back.
Yep, kind of where I'm at too. It's going to be a little bit harder, but you have a quarterback, you have a chance. So, Will, on that point, when we end this episode here, DJ Lagway is on ESPN's way too early 2025 Heisman Trophy contenders, as he should be. You and I talked about it. I think it was off air or something. We talked about the quarterbacks in the SEC. It was like, well, he's certainly going to be one of the top ones there. Has to be a Heisman contender next year based off of what you see and the hype he's going to surround himself with. And look, I mean, Vegas is going to put odds out there because of the name DJ Lagway, just the name alone, but based off of what he's shown this year. But Will, just some other quarterbacks on the list. Garrett Nussmeier on this list as well.
I'm so happy he's coming back.
I know.
Keep coming back. You never trusted Nussmeier. That's my. There are a lot of things that are truths in college football, but never trusted Nussmeier. That one's up at the top.
Lenore Sellers in the SEC as well, of course, with what DJ Lagway has shown. Sellers has shown a lot of those same things there at South Carolina. Looking in the SEC, hey, quarterbacks Florida will go against. Arch Manning at Texas, of course, he's going to be on the list. Nico Iamaleava, of course, he's going to be on the list there at Tennessee as well. Nate Frazier, the running back at Georgia, is on this list. So I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, about 15-ish names here. DJ Lagway in that group of guys I just named. Jeremiah Smith there at Ohio State, Sam Levitt, Arizona State, Drew Aller at Penn State, Ryan Williams, wide receiver at Bama, Jordan James, running back at Oregon, and Cade Klubnik at Clemson. So there's your list for ESPN's way too early Heisman Trophy contenders. No surprise, Will, that DJ Lagway is on that list.
No, not at all. I mean, so Danny Werfel had a QB rating of 146.1 in 1993 as a true freshman, 151.3 as a sophomore, and that was over almost 500 attempts, had a QB rating of a little bit under 150. DJ Lagway was at 159.6 as a true freshman. Now, certainly Werfel took a jump in 95 and 96, but if you look at a guy like Peyton Manning, he was somebody who – I'm not sure ever had a QB rating higher than Lagway in his 4 years there at Tennessee. In fact, so 145.2, 146.5, 147.7, 147.7. So, and both of those guys don't have any of the mobility that DJ Lagway does. DJ Lagway did something really special this year as a true freshman. Granted, 157 attempts. Granted, he didn't play the entire season. And granted, when he finally got an opportunity to play, he did pull a hamstring. And so, we'll have to make sure that he's able to make his way through a full SEC season. But if Lagway plays just like he did this year, he averaged 10.3 yards per attempt. 10.3 yards per attempt. You don't average 10.3 yards per attempt without leading a top 10 offense. It's almost impossible to do. And you factor that in with the fact that he averaged over 2 yards per rush, and that was with taking a bunch of sacks that I don't think he's going to take next year. I think Florida is set up to have a stud at the quarterback position the next 2 years. Now, can he win the Heisman Trophy? I mean, look, you got to be the best player in the country. You got to win a bunch of games, and maybe he needs to play some linebacker too, given what we saw this year with the Heisman Trophy vote. But look, when you're the quarterback on a playoff team in the SEC, you're going to get some significant votes. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense for him to be there. And I don't want to gloss over. It's not that DJ Lagway played well for a true freshman. DJ Lagway played well. And there's a difference between, he's an all SEC freshman team versus if he'd have played all year, he would have been in the running for all SEC quarterback, right? Like those stats. And I mean, that's with a guy who had 11 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. So he has some steps to take to get better, but he played well for just an SEC quarterback this year as a true freshman, which is why we're so excited about it. It's not, and again, it's sort of what I said earlier. Like we said, these guys need to take a step up. These guys if DJ Lagway plays exactly like he did in 2024 for the entire season for 2025, Florida's going to win 9 games. If he takes a step, then Florida has an opportunity to win 10 or 11. And that's where they are. And that's a cool place to be, because it's been a long time since we've been looking at Florida's roster during an offseason saying 11 wins is a total. I mean, we walked into this season going, we're not going to win the SEC. The schedule's brutal. Like, get yourself prepared. 7 wins will be a good year. And it was sort of a topsy-turvy way to get there, but Florida gets there to 7-5 and has sort of set themselves up for 2025. Now, can Napier deliver? Can the rest of the team deliver? That's an open question. But I think, from DJ Lagway and what he showed his freshman season, he deserves to be on those Heisman lists. And, I've been saying now for a couple of months, he's got an opportunity for like a monument park. like if he turns this thing around, you got to look at, can we build like an extra large statue for DJ Lagway? Does it have to be the same size? Because Tebow had some monsters around him, man. Like the level of talent that he had. And even you think about the receivers that Werfel had out there. Florida may raid the transfer portal and may bring in some real studs, but I am pretty sure that they are not going to have Percy Harvin out there at wide receiver while Lagway's out there. And so, we need to build him a bigger statue if he's able to bring a trophy home to Florida.
Here. Oh man, there we go. A lot of news, of course, to get caught up on. As I said, had to miss some over the weekend. Throat's hurting right now, but I'll get through it. Will, no time to slow down though. I mean, we got a bowl game preview this week. Got Tulane and the bowl game Friday there for the Gators, so there will be a preview out later this week here on Gators Breakdown. What are you doing for? You're coming down here, so what's your schedule like this week?
So there will be a preview up. We're flying down Thursday, and and then we're still in negotiations about going to the bowl game. Max, the star of Read and Reaction the past couple of weeks, because he's a good luck charm, has not really been behaving all that well, and so it's entirely possible.
So you got to worry about y'all and Santa Claus.
Well, that's true. I think I'm trying to convince my wife, just give him a bunch of coal and let me take him to the game, but I'm not sure. We'll see whether that works or not. So I'm hoping to still be able to get to the game. Not entirely sure that's going to happen. And, it'll be Max's fault if we don't go. So I'll blame it on him. I'm just excited. I got that. I got a picture of him on top of one of the Gators in Gainesville with his hand up in the air. And I've been tweeting victory every time he wins, or every time Florida wins. And so I've been able to do it 3 straight times ever since we went to that LSU game. So you got your recruiting meme every time we get a commit. I got a meme for Max every time we get a win. So hopefully I can put that one up there one more time.
Sounds good. So, all right. Yeah, there we go. Both of us right there. Read Reaction here at Gators Breakdown as well. We'll be previewing the bowl game between Florida and Tulane. I'll probably have an episode after the game on Friday. Of course, I'll have some family in town for the holiday. So we'll see how it all breaks out. But certainly we'll be ready there. Will, safe travels this week, man, as you come down here for Florida. Spend some time with family, and hopefully you get to make it to the bowl game.
Hey, man, it was snowing yesterday up here, so I am ready to be down there. I'll be down in Fort Myers most of the time, so it'll be nice and warm.
All right, everybody. That's Will Miles, Read Reaction on YouTube, at Will Miles SEC. You can find him on social media. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on social media at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thank you for joining us on this episode of Gators Breakdown.